any of it. And let me get the chat open too. Feel free to unmute yourself and just say something if you'd like to jump in, or type something in chat. I'll keep the chat window open here. So did I start? Yeah, I did start the recording. Okay, so when we talk about closing equity gaps, we probably should talk about which gap. And the gaps that most people talk about are by race and ethnicity, by gender, and by income, and by first-gen status, because that's where we tend to observe most of the differences in student success in terms of completion, persistence towards a degree, and so on. And also in terms of who applies to college and who goes to college. And just as one indicator of the differences here, this is data from the National Center for Educational Statistics from 2020, which looks at the 6-year graduation rate based on racial identification. And if we compare, for example, the, Asian students or self-identified Asian students are 77% of the students who start college complete a 4-year degree, who start a 4-year degree, complete that within 6 years. In terms of at the other end, Black students, only 42% successfully complete a 4-year degree within a 6-year time period. And similarly, people who report themselves as mixed race or Hispanic, Pacific Islanders, tend to do less well than white and Asian students in terms of completion. And there's a lot of reasons for that we'll be talking about, or things we can do to help provide a more equitable outcome. And one of the most important things we can do, and actually Jessica gave a workshop a couple of days ago on belongingness, is building a sense of belonging within the class. That if you are part of a group that is not typically represented in the college population, or in which you're a very small proportion, or you feel like an outsider, you're much less likely to persist to a degree. So, and in general, the more that campuses and classes and faculty can build a sense of community within the classes and within the institution in general, the more likely it is that these gaps in outcomes will be smaller. A year and a half ago, we did a reading group on relationship-rich education, which focuses on the importance of community in student success. And that was based on the experiences that they had at Rice, at Elon University. And they put a lot of effort into creating more sense of community in the institution and within classes and organizations and so forth. And they've had some fairly significant reductions in equity gaps in response to this. Some simple things that we can do in the classroom. One of the most simple ones that shows up in many studies is simply learning students' names and learning how to pronounce those names. That when you call students by name, it gets their attention. It's just a very simple sign that you recognize them as individuals that would be really helpful to use. In larger classes, it can be more challenging. Some people, last year we did a reading group on inclusive teaching by Vici Sathi and Kelly Hogan. One of the things they talked about doing in their large class is by having little name plaques, placards that go on the desk where people write their names in big print and ask them to bring them to class so you could call the students by name. Similarly, you could also use a random name generator even when you're calling on students so that you're at least calling on students by name. And it's a simple thing and it can be really helpful. Again, it's a bit harder in large classes, but to the extent to which you can do it, it's very beneficial in helping students feel that they're part of that classroom community. Another simple thing you can do is show up a few minutes early and stay late and talk to students at the beginning and the end of the class. So while you're waiting for the class to start, talk to people within the classroom. If you're setting up the computer, you may not be able to talk to many students beyond the first row or two, but if you don't have a lot to set up, or if you get there early enough to set up, you could just wander around and chat with students throughout the class. And simply staying late and not trying to be the first one out the door at the end of the class also creates a more welcoming environment where students can ask you questions or talk and so forth. And when you're having students work on activities, don't hide behind the podium, walk around the classroom as much as you can. You know, ask students how they're doing, ask students if they're having any, or how the problem is going, ask them if they need any assistance and so forth. You know, or as you're wandering around, you'll hear people struggling about something, and, you know, assisting them can be really helpful. One other thing that's often recommended, and it can make a big difference in forming personal connections with students, is discovering their interests. And there's a lot of ways you can do that. One way is simply by having an introductory discussion forum within your class, within Brightspace, for example, where you ask students to talk about the things that they're most interested in, what their career plans are, what type of work experiences they've had, what they're planning to do once they leave college and so on, asking them perhaps about their hobbies and other things. And once you know more about the students who are in your class, you can come up with examples and tie it to things of interest to the individual students. So if you know you have a number of people who play sports, you can use perhaps sports as an example in a way that will not alienate those who may not be familiar with those particular sports. But just trying to connect as much as you can to the students' interests and motivation can be helpful. And also you can, one of the strategies that in a reading group we did the year before was a form that was developed at Lafayette University, and it's available online, which is a Who's in Class form, where students are asked a whole series of questions about their identities and so forth anonymously, and it gives you a summary of a breakdown of the students in terms of their race, in terms of their family structure, in terms of a wide variety of factors. So you can get a breakdown of what your class consists of, which you might want to share with the class, so that if someone feels that they're the only person from a particular group in the class, or who identify with a particular group, if you have a large enough group, just sharing the fact that there's others from the same sort of identity groups can be helpful. If that works well in your application. And just reminding students that your role on the class is to help them learn, and that you are available to help them. And a common thing, and this has come up in many workshops, is instead of calling your office hours, you know, calling them student hours or student assistance hours or something similar is really helpful. Tony Jacks, who had a book come out a couple of years ago and who was on campus about 2 years ago, noted that when he first went to college, he had no idea what office hours were. And he and many other first-gen students thought that, well, maybe office hours were times when faculty were busy in their office. So those were the times when you didn't want to interrupt or interfere with faculty. So, you know, letting them know that you're there to help them, and that the times you set aside for them to work with them are times that you've reserved for them. Using appointment calendars can also be helpful, where they can sign up for individual times, so they don't worry about coming into your office hours and it being crowded with other people. That can work well. During the class, there's a lot of things, and this is true for any group or organization that you're working with. You can try to build more student-to-student connections. Using cooperative or team-based learning activities can be a really helpful way in terms of forming groups. Now, if you're creating teams, you'd like to have balanced teams, and there's a number of ways in which you can do that. One is, if you have a large enough class, you could do it purely randomly, or you could do it using some neutral criteria that's not tied to students' identities in some way. Well, for example, one of the things I do when I'm working with econometric students or students in the Applied Mathematical Economics seminar is they work in group, but they have a variety of different levels of prior background in mathematics, for example. And one thing I'll do is I'll have them enter their name and just list the number of prior math and statistics courses that they've had at SUNY Oswego. And then I sort it from highest to lowest. And then I'll just go down, if there's say 10 groups, I'll just go down number 1 through 10, and then repeat that over and over again, so that each group will have someone who has a large number of math and stat courses. Each group will have some other people who don't have as much. And that way we know that the groups, or at least on average, those groups should be roughly comparable in terms of performance and in terms of their ability to work well together. It's not generally a good idea to let students form their own groups, simply because they'll often say, well, we'd like to form our own groups. But my response has been that if you form your own groups, well, how would you form groups? And I said, well, a lot of us have taken courses together. I say, so the people who've taken the most economics courses together or the most math courses together would know more students. And the ones who would not be placed in these groups would be the people who haven't had as much experience in the discipline. And I say, is that a very productive strategy to create a very, balanced set of groups? And generally they'll recognize that and say, yeah, this would be better if we do it, without tying it to the number of courses we had together, because that tends to be very exclusionary, because the people who haven't had as much experience in the discipline would generally be the leftover groups who wouldn't have that same sort of connection. Now, having said that, there has been some research that shows that when groups are formed, groups that are majority male often tend to have a lower rating of female participation in it by all the participants, male and female. And in general, when there have been studies of, in laboratory experiments, females do tend to speak less in all male groups, partly because males often dominate the conversation, and partly it may be because of, cultural habits and so forth. But in any case, what the research suggests is that women are much more likely to be rated as active participants, and in fact participate more actively when they're in all female groups. So that might be a case for not using purely random assignments. There haven't been any studies yet that have been published that I'm aware of, at least, that look at similar breakdowns by race. But I know that a group of researchers actually at it's in Utah, but in any case, is currently investigating that in using a series of experiments. And there should be some experiments and actually field experiments, and there should be some results on that coming out soon. But in any case, neutral criteria generally works fairly well, but there is a possibility, again, that males may dominate the conversation in male majority groups. Okay. When you have students working in groups in general or building community, give the students the opportunity to express their work in multiple ways. We have students with very diverse backgrounds. Some students have had a lot of experience in writing, others may not. Some students may be really good at creating videos and so forth. And giving students a chance to express themselves in ways that are more comfortable for them can be helpful. This is not as much a case when we're in class experiences, but when we went remote during COVID, a lot of students were doing nearly all of their work on their smartphones. And writing papers on a smartphone is generally not the easiest type of thing to do. But if you have a smartphone, it's relatively easy to take videos and to edit videos and to produce videos. And so giving students the ability to use the tools that they have, especially if they're online students or they're in a remote environment, could be helpful in giving students more equitable opportunities for expression, for demonstrating their learning. In general, peer instruction while working in groups in some form is extremely valuable. That when students explain things to each other, some students will have better understanding of some topics than others. The students who already have a deeper understanding because of past experiences, either life experiences or of prior coursework and so forth, benefit by explaining concepts to other students. And students who have not yet attained mastery of some of the concepts in the class benefit more by hearing it from fellow students who are at a comparable level of cognitive development. They benefit much more from that than they do from hearing it from an instructor, because instructors generally often have trouble understanding some of the barriers to understanding that students have, because we've gotten past those. But students who've only recently mastered the material are often able to find ways of expressing it to other students that tend to work more effectively than when we do. And there's been a lot of research about this. I know some of you were at a workshop I did a couple of days ago where we talked about the use of undergraduate and graduate TAs. Basically, just to summarize it really quickly, students who had undergraduate TAs learned more than when they were working with graduate TAs, in part because the undergraduate TAs were more effective at expressing things at a level that other undergraduate students could understand. Graduate students had moved a little beyond that, and it was harder for them to explain things in ways that undergraduates would make sense of. Finding ways to encourage students to get to know each other, just simply the first, maybe not every time, but at least the first few times when you have students get together, if you're using different groups periodically, ask them to introduce themselves to each other and tell you something about each other. There's various activities you can do that, icebreaker type activities. But just simply asking students to introduce themselves to the students around them in class, or when you're doing some type of group activity, can be really, really helpful. I was giving a presentation at a conference a couple of years ago where we had people working groups and they were going to talk about their application of some concepts. And what occurred basically is they really didn't say very much at first. And then we said, well, talk to each other, introduce yourself. Where are you from? Why are you here? What are you interested in getting out of this? And all of a sudden, those barriers broke down. That once they got comfortable talking to other people, they got right on task. But it took that initial ice breaking to get people to work on task. When you're doing discussions, use inclusive discussion strategies. And that means that not only are you giving people an equal chance to talk, but you're also providing ways in which students can express their knowledge in ways they're comfortable with. One of the barriers that many students have is that, for people who are introverts, they're not always that comfortable expressing themselves. You have some students who want to dominate the discussion. You have other students who perhaps would prefer not to ever have to speak in class. And you want to find a way that gets all their voices heard. One simple thing you can do is, instead of using whole class discussions, do a lot of small group discussions, and where you can have people share within the group. And if students are not that comfortable voicing their own opinions, if they meet with one or two or three or four other people and they come up with a group viewpoint, most students who might be uncomfortable expressing their own opinion are much more comfortable talking about the concepts that the group appear, because it's less threatening than exposing their own thoughts on some issue. So small groups are useful. And if you do small groups, make sure that you rotate the roles within the groups, often assigning specific roles or having the groups assign it, but making sure that they rotate it so that everyone gets to be a part of the group process. And so, make sure you provide balanced participation with some accountability to make sure that, people are not being ignored and so forth. In terms of course design, using inclusive examples, avoid practices that generate stereotype threat. We certainly don't want to be singling people out because of their race, their gender, ethnicity, and so forth. We don't want to have one student be a representative for all people of the groups they belong to. One thing that is particularly bad are equity walks, which have sometimes been used, where you have your whole class line up and then you basically separate those people who are privileged from those who aren't. And that just tends to encourage the stereotype threat. And it's generally seen as it being, even though many people advocate it, it's seen as being a very inequitable practice. Decolonizing your curriculum, getting as many voices represented in your readings and your readings, videos, podcasts, and other things that students might be learning from can be really helpful in creating an inclusive environment. Another thing you can do is, especially if you can't decolonize your curriculum, or if you can't find many inclusive examples, ask students to make their own connections between what they're learning in class and their own experience in their communities, or what they expect to be doing in the rest of their lives. Another thing that could be really useful, and there's a lot of research on this, is building a growth mindset. And growth mindset is basically when students believe that they can learn more, that knowledge is something which can be expanded, and that part of the process of becoming more proficient in a given discipline is by developing skills and working at it and making mistakes along the way. That mistakes are an essential part of learning. And that's something that students don't always believe. Many students believe in a fixed mindset, which means either they're good at something or they're not good at it. And we've all seen this. You know, I hear all the time from students saying, I'm not a math person, or people will say, I'm not an art person, or I'm not an X person, and so forth. And in general, getting students to believe that they are capable of learning and improving is an essential component of students being successful in learning. And there's lots of things we can do to encourage it. You know, normalize the fact that any learning takes place by making mistakes and trying it. That concept of failing forward. One thing that many people can do is talk about their own barriers, things that they've tried and failed at, and then learn from the experience to become better. And if, you know, you might want to use past academic struggles where you struggled in a course and how you got past that. And, you know, normalize the fact that, you know, we're human and we struggle along the way. Using low stakes or no stakes assessment can also help students see that they can become better at something by practice, by working at it. You know, high stakes exams are kind of the opposite of what we'd like to do to build this. Give students the opportunity for learning from their mistakes and being more successful. Angela Bauer, who we had on the podcast a few years ago, she was at Green Bay and now she's at High Point in North Carolina. She used a few growth mindset interventions that had a significant improvement in students' learning. I think she was teaching biology classes. And in the Green Bay case, she did some extra workshops, and then she tried moving that to High Point. It didn't work as well. But what she did in High Point as a department chair in the biology department is she had students take one slide every week and add it. It was commonly used in all their intro biology classes that emphasized this notion of a growth mindset, how people had tried something, failed from it, and how that led to advancements in knowledge. And that simple growth mindset messaging completely eliminated most of the different types of equity gaps that we talked about before. So it was remarkably important. Faculty mindset turns out to be just about as important as student mindset. There was a study done a few years ago, about 2.5 years ago now, where faculty were assessed in STEM fields, were given a mindset survey about whether they believed that students could learn from mistakes or whether students had this fixed level of ability and their job was to sort them out into high ability and lower ability students. And what they found in that study, it was a very well done study, is that faculty who had a fixed mindset tended to have students with lower performance on all observable measures. But what makes it worse is they also ended up with larger equity gaps. Those faculty who had a growth mindset ended up having all students doing better in their classes, but the people who benefited the most from having faculty with a growth mindset were the students who would generally, on average, be more likely to be on the losing side of those equity gaps. So in general, first-gen students, Pell eligible students, and historically minoritized students ended up doing better when faculty members did relatively better. They gained more when faculty members had a growth mindset. You know, one of the things that is common, and if you've attended a number of these workshops, as I know some of you have, there's evidence-based teaching practices are important in all of these things we'd like to achieve. That in general, if we encourage students to use a lot of research, let me go back a step. A lot of research has been done over the years in terms of how we learn. And research shows that if we encourage students to develop habits that are consistent learning practices that are consistent with how we know that people learn, students learn more. They're using their time more efficiently. And there's some basic principles that have shown up now in thousands of studies. Retrieval practice we've known about for over a century. And that basically is that the more you practice retrieving information, the better you are at being able to retrieve that information in the future. The more practice you make trying to retrieve information, the more likely it is that you'll be able to retrieve that information in the long term. And that tends to persist for relatively long periods of time. And that's the opposite of what most students tend to do. And the reward structures we develop in courses tend to reward cramming, what students tend to do is they tend to repeatedly reread material. So they repeat attempts to store information rather than repeating attempts to retrieve it. And increased efforts to store information is not helpful in general in being able to retrieve that information later. Space practice is also really helpful, that if we can encourage students to space out their study sessions, to use shorter study sessions spread out over longer time periods, the more that they will recall. And again, there's a lot of experimental evidence on that. Another thing which is shown pretty much in all of these studies to be really important is interleave practice, which involves practice in activities that are not blocked. And what block practice does is when you have, you study the same, well, it's a way in which most textbooks and many courses are structured, where you'll first learn one concept and then you'll do a whole series of concepts or questions associated with that or practice exercises. Then you move to another concept and you'll do another series of practice activities with that. Interleave practice involves the same type of instruction, the same type of learning of different techniques, but it adds to that the fact that you now have to pick out which type of technique you need to apply. It raises the level of complexity. And in general, what all the research suggests is that adding a little bit more complexity, a little more challenge to the process of learning or trying to retrieve information makes it more likely that you'll retrieve it over a longer, you'll be able to retrieve it over a longer period of time. And you'll also be better able to transfer it from one application to another. So a classic study that was done in terms of block versus interleave practice is all students watched 10 videos, watched 4 videos about how to find the volume of 4 different 3-dimensional objects. In one case, they watched a video and then they answered 10 multiple choice questions. And then in the next case, they watched the next video, answered 10 questions, and so forth. So it was block practice. They learn something, they apply it, they move to a new topic, they apply it. And in the other case, they watched all 4 videos and then they were given the same 40 questions, but they were randomly mixed. And so students not only had to be able to recall and use a formula, they had to be able to identify and recall which formula to use. The students who had the block practice did extremely well, something around 90% or so correct when they were given, here's one type of equation, you plug the numbers and you get the results. And they did substantially less well, though, for the group that had the interlead practice. They ended up scoring somewhere around a 60 or so, or 50 or something in that range. I forgot the exact numbers in the most commonly cited study. But then what they did is they tested them a week later. And a week later, the people who had used the block practice scored at a level that was perfect, which was not significantly different than random guessing would have resulted. While the people who had the block practice actually had scores that went up a little bit a week later. So it's, again, what Bjork and Bjork referred to as desirable difficulties, adding some difficulties that make the learning a little bit more challenging or requires you to do more cognitive processing while you're learning something, increases the likelihood that you'll remember it. So these are things that would be really good to build into our courses. Metacognitive reflection is having students reflect on their learning and become more adept at understanding what they know and how well they know it. And again, there's a lot of research that suggests that students who develop metacognitive skills tend to be able to learn more effectively, which is probably not surprising. If you're better able to assess your learning, you're better able to focus your learning efforts on things that you need to spend more time on. And there's a number of ways of building this into the course structure. One thing is adaptive learning or personalized learning systems automatically build this in, or mastery learning approaches build in some of this, or can be structured to build this in, because most of these systems, or at least adaptive learning and personalized learning systems, such as those provided by Lumen Learning, essentially were designed by people who studied how people learn, and it allows, well, and it basically encourages the use of retrieval practice, spaced practice, interlead practice, and typically some degree of metacognitive reflection by simply asking students how confident they are about things and then giving them some feedback about whether that confidence was accurate or whether perhaps it was misplaced. And so if you use one of these platforms, particularly in adaptive learning or one of the Lumen Learning Waymaker packages, which are called personalized learning systems, that can be really effective. You could build your own system if you have lots of questions available to you, or if you're willing to develop a lot of them, where you have students do a little bit of block practice when they first learn something, but then give them progressively cumulative exams, or periodically when they're working on new topics, have some throwbacks to earlier concepts, and also build some interlead practice into the assessment. So students not only are just plugging numbers into a formula that works in a specific case, they're also identifying which formulas are most appropriate or which models are most appropriate for particular challenges. Another issue in terms of, there's a lot in this, and it was probably, I'm racing through it, I'm sorry about that. But in any case, one issue that we've been learning a lot about is the importance of resource scarcity. If people aren't sure where the next meal is coming from, if they're not sure if they're going to be able to cover the rental payments, if they're not sure about how they're going to be able to make pay other bills or pay medical bills and so forth, that significantly impairs attention and cognitive performance. And that we know is an area that can lead to some significant problems. Financial and food insecurity can interfere substantially with learning. And that's something that I know our college is doing a lot, and most colleges are doing a lot to try to address these issues, but our students are still, many of our students, and a growing proportion of students are still struggling with this. One easier thing to address is the delays in purchasing text and other materials, that the students who are most likely to put off purchasing a text are generally the students who are already most at risk because of their first gen or their income status and so forth. And in general, we can resolve that in a number of ways. One is by using OER materials when they're available in the course. Another is by at least having the book fee built into, the book cost for ebooks built into your course. The inclusive access program we use here at Oswego can be helpful in doing that, because even though students still have to pay for their books and materials, it's part of their financial aid package that covers tuition. It also covers those books. So they don't have to come up with their own funds to buy text, and they're not going to be delaying it. And at least all students have the same first day access to their course materials. And again, providing sufficient support for students in terms of mental health, food insecurity, et cetera. And I know all colleges are struggling with this, and we've certainly ramped up all our efforts on these things, but we still could go further. And certainly there has been a bit of a mental health pandemic of itself on its own right in terms of mental health challenges that students have been reporting. This has been talked about in many other sections in the last couple of reading groups. Providing students with more structure is helpful. Scaffolding assignments and giving students feedback at every stage so that students don't end up with a high stakes exam or a high stakes assessment activity where they don't know how they're doing until it's kind of too late to go back and start over again. Giving students feedback from the beginning to the end of any project can be really helpful in creating a more equitable system, because the students who tend to do better on high stakes assessments are the students who've had the most practice with those types of high stakes assessments. Students who've never written a research paper would be at substantial disadvantage if the only graded activity consists of high stakes research papers they haven't had practice. So, have students turn in a proposal for a topic, have them turn in a bibliography, an annotated bibliography, an outline, a rough draft of sections of that and so forth, and giving them feedback so that if students are getting off track, you can guide them back before they've wasted too much time in ineffective directions. Providing clear and completed instructions is helpful, and also giving students examples of high quality work, and maybe also some examples of lower quality work so they can evaluate what makes an assignment effective and what makes it less effective. If you have, it's generally pretty easy to ask students who've done high quality work in one semester if they'd be willing to share their work with future students. It might be a little tougher to ask students who did less quality work, but you could always generate some of those on your own or generate some examples of what would be meant by a lower quality assignment for a specific activity. We're all capable of doing low quality work if we put our minds to it. And it's not that hard to put together something that could serve as an exemplar of either. One thing that Ken Bain does in his writing class, or he used to do in his writing classes, is, he noted that when he got the first term papers from students, some of them were extremely good, others were extremely poor. And it was clear that a lot of students didn't really know what constituted a good term paper and what were the characteristics of that. So he wrote some papers, high quality papers, a middle quality paper, and a low quality paper, and he handed them out to groups of students, and he asked them to evaluate. He said, one of these is an A paper, one of these is a B paper, and one of these is a C- or a D paper. Look through them as a group, or they were essays or something like that, writing sample. And he said, look through them as a group and then determine which one fits into each category and why they fit into each category. And he used that, and then he had the whole class discuss that, and they used that to create a rubric to evaluate writing on projects similar to that. And when students have looked at it and they come up to their own opinions of what constitutes good work, and generally consensus was formed pretty quickly, it was easier for them to do high quality work after they've had these discussions and came up with these criteria. And they have much more buy-in when they had a say in all this. Okay, so active learning, we know in every study, in every study I've seen, increases learning for all students. And in general, it increases performance, grades, and persistence, and lowers drop, fail, withdrawal rates for all groups, but it disproportionately benefits the students who are most at risk. And in some cases, the introduction of active learning techniques have completely eliminated equity gaps, in large part because students are given the opportunity to wrestle with material and to master it before they have higher staked assessments. An interesting phenomena, though, is when students are surveyed about their evaluation of what is the most effective instruction, students generally prefer lectures, and they believe they learn more from a lecture. Yet, when there have been in many studies, students were in either controlled experiments or other people evaluated the proportion of time that classes spent in lecture and so forth, and the proportion that was spent in active learning. Students in classes where more active learning were used believed they learned less and believed that the instructor was less helpful in increasing learning than in the classes where the instructors lectured. But what actually happened is that students exhibited better outcomes, higher learning gains, and so forth in the classes where active learning was used. It just doesn't feel as nice, because if you're sitting in a lecture, you can nod and smile and it all makes sense and you feel that you've learned it. But if you actually have to take that material and apply it, try to solve a problem with it, try to wrestle with it and to apply it in a different context, it's more cognitive effort. It doesn't feel as good. It doesn't feel like you've learned as much. However, you do, but it's a bit of a barrier that we have to overcome. And the more people who use active learning approaches, the easier it will be to help convince students that active learning is more effective. And here's some slides I put together. And oh, wait. Okay, I've got 3 things here. Oh, I may have messed up the link. Okay. Ignore that URL, but if you scan that QR code, this will take you to resources. I put in another QR code before and I put the URL in 2 places. Sorry about that. In any case, this will take you to resources. This will take you to a Jamboard where we don't have too much time to use that now. We don't have that many people here now, but there's also a copy of these slides. So if you click on that, or if you scan that, it will give you a copy of the Google Slides, and I'll see if I can fix that link. Actually, I can put a link to the resources in chat here, so that they're right there. Here we go. So I don't want to make a copy of that. I want to get the link to that. So any questions, comments, or thoughts? After talking about the benefits of active learning and so forth, how did that, that's not the link. Okay, one more time. That was from the last workshop. I'm going to get the link for this document. There we go. I'm going to copy the link this time, which apparently I didn't before. And I'm going to share that link and there. And this should take you to the resources. And the resource page consists of a series of studies that address all these issues. So these are some of the studies that provides evidence on each of these topics. So, there's a lot of resources there. So if you're not convinced of this, looking at the evidence can be really effective. And again, there's a lot of material packed in a very short period of time. Any questions, thoughts, comments? Okay, it looks like it's just you, Jennifer, now. So we'll stop here and have a good day and see you soon.
Thanks.
Thanks.
See you.